Boldwood presents The Cursed Heir, written by Heather Atkinson and read by Sarah Barron. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Alardyce House, just outside Edinburgh, Scotland. Boxing Day, December 1896. Pain. It was all she knew. Amy's hands were agony, the fingers broken, all the nails ripped from them, dripping blood onto the hard table she was tethered to. Her feet throbbed from the vicious bite of the red-hot poker. "Amy, where's Robert?" said Matthew's cold, hard voice. "Go to hell," she retorted weakly. More pain, the stench of blood filling her nostrils, but the blood was all hers. Edward, her own cousin, grinned maniacally as he applied the poker to the soles of her feet again. As she screamed, she wasn't sure what hurt most, the physical pain or the pain of his betrayal. She'd run to him for help, thinking him her friend, one of the few she had in the world, when in fact he was a twisted psychopath, as twisted as Matthew, the father of her son. Well, she was damned if she was going to sell out her own child to this pair, even if it cost her her life. The sound of the door opening caused Amy to jump awake. She'd dozed off in the armchair before the window in her bedroom. It had been snowing heavily for a couple of days, coating the land in a thick white blanket. Although it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, the sky was almost black, blocking out what little light there was. But that was fine by Amy. The turbulence outside seemed to reflect her pain within. "Are you all right?" said her husband Henry, concern etched on his handsome face. His hair was still so dark it was almost black, but starting to speckle with grey, his eyes equally dark. In contrast, his skin was pale, almost as white as the snow outside, and his body tall and slender. Just the sight of him made Amy's heart beat harder. "Bad dreams," she murmured. Even though 9 years had elapsed since she'd been tortured and almost killed, the horror had never diminished, and the dreams, although less frequent, still haunted her. She ran a hand down her face, as though she could wipe the nightmare away. If only it was that easy. The past was always present. The snow started to fall again, tiny, exquisite flakes landing on the glass before melting into water. The fire was roaring in the grate. Amy had been unable to get the cold out of her bones ever since she'd had her eyes open to the horrifying truth about Robert, her eldest son, just the previous evening, ruining what had been up until then a wonderful Christmas day. She held out one of her damaged hands to Henry, and he took it. He was one of the very few people not repulsed by her hands. The fingers were twisted and bent after being badly broken by Edward, Henry's younger brother. The flesh where her nails once were was red and angry, even after all these years. When she was out in public, she always wore gloves. At least she didn't have to worry any more about Edward, who had been hanged for his sick crimes. "Why don't you come downstairs?" said Henry. "Everyone's asking after you." "I can't face them. What will I say?" "I told them you have a headache, but if you don't come down, they'll only insist on coming up here to see you." "How can I look those good people in the eye? I've spawned a devil." The memory of Robert's disturbing leer at one of the servant girls, eyes rolling back in his head and mouth stretching into a grotesque grimace, made her shudder. It had been the same look his insane, murdering biological father Matthew had pulled, and God knew she'd seen it often enough to know what it meant. She'd thought Robert was all goodness, that he'd inherited nothing from Matthew Kroll, but she'd discovered she was wrong only the previous evening, just when his engagement to a sweet, beautiful girl had been announced, and she couldn't bear it. "This is not your fault," said Henry. "I will not have you blaming yourself." "I can't believe I never saw it before. I should have done. she replied, feeling sick at the memory of those bruises on the wrists of Daisy, their pretty maid. You get ahead of yourself. We can't be sure he's even guilty. The maid never accused him. All she gave you was a look. I saw him pull that same nightmarish face Matthew used to pull. Amy shivered, and it was nothing to do with the snow outside. There's no denying what I saw. Talk to the maid first and get the whole story, please. We don't want to accuse him unjustly. Very well. I'll talk to Daisy before approaching Robert. Thank you. Now, why don't you come downstairs? The last thing we want is anyone asking awkward questions. She nodded. Very well, then. I'm glad. It's not the same without you. Christmas is such a happy time in this house now. When I was a boy, it was so dour with Edward and my parents. Amy wasn't surprised. Henry's younger brother Edward had been hanged for the murder of 4 servant girls, as well as the imprisonment and torture of Amy herself. His mother Lenora, dead of cancer, had been cold and arrogant, and had plotted to bring about Amy's downfall. His father Alfred had been murdered by Matthew to stop him from freeing Amy and Robert from him. Now, with you and our children, it's my favourite time of year, continued Henry, touching her face. Amy decided it was time to pull herself together. She didn't want to spoil this special time for him. Did I ever tell you how fortunate I am to have you as my husband? You're not as fortunate as I am to have you as my wife. He smiled. Henry's manner was usually so stiff and formal. It had become a habit with him since childhood, after being raised by a vindictive mother to hide his emotions. But with Amy and their children, he allowed his playful side to come out. Now, come down for breakfast before the whole damn house ventures up here. Amy took his hand and allowed him to lead her to the door, feeling sick with foreboding, wondering how she was going to look upon her oldest son with love again. Amy, you're feeling better, smiled Mr. Buchanan. You rushed off very quickly last night. He and his wife Mildred had become firm family friends. He was the family solicitor and had been a staunch supporter of Amy throughout her recovery after her imprisonment and torture at Edward's hands. The majority of society had ostracised their family in the aftermath, when all Amy's secrets had tumbled out into the public domain. That she had had an affair with a servant and produced an illegitimate child, and that the father of that child had turned out to be just as insane and evil as Edward Alardyce. But Mr. Buchanan and his wife refused to bow to public pressure and had maintained their close friendship with the Alardyces. It was only now, 9 years later, that society was starting to open its doors to them again, mainly thanks to Henry's wealth and influence. Not that he and Amy were concerned with society. They were happy in each other's company and the company of their family and close friends. But there were their children's future to consider, so they were gradually building bridges. I am, thank you, Arthur, she replied. I had an awful headache, but it's gone now. It must have been all the excitement yesterday. And the surprise of your son getting engaged to Jane probably contributed. Amy's stomach lurched, but she managed to force a smile. Sit down, dear. You need to eat something, said Henry, sweeping her into a chair at the massive dining table, the footman furnishing her with tea and toast. Amy gripped onto her toast so hard it snapped when the door to the dining room opened, but it was only Esther. Morning, said Esther sunnily, taking a seat. Esther was always cheerful these days, and Amy thought no one deserved happiness more. She had been married to Matthew, Robert's real father, when he was masquerading as Matthew Huntington, who had only cared about sweet Esther's wealth. Amy had inadvertently taken a position as governess to Esther's niece Jane after she'd fled Alardyce, and despite the difference in their supposed stations, they had become friends. Esther had freed Amy from Huntington House after Matthew had locked her up when he discovered he was Robert's father, only for her to be imprisoned and tortured by Edward instead. Amy loved and respected Esther. After the suffering they'd endured together, a close bond had formed between them. "Where are the twins?" said Arthur. He adored children, but all his were grown up, and he was eagerly awaiting grandchildren. "Still fast asleep, poor darlings," replied Esther. After Matthew had died, she'd found happiness with William, an extremely wealthy man with a gentle temperament. He was just what Esther needed after so many years of Matthew's bullying. After being unable to have children with Matthew and thinking herself barren, she'd given birth to twin boys who were now 6 years old. "Nanny will see to them when they wake." Esther looked to Amy. "Are you all right? You hurried up to bed last night." "I had a dreadful headache, but it's gone now." "I'm glad about that, but you missed all the celebrations. Who would have thought all those years ago, when Robert and Jane met as children, that they would end up as man and wife?" Amy swallowed hard at the memory of those two small children, Robert with his dark hair and black eyes, and Jane, the little blonde doll with the china blue eyes. "We have a lot of planning to do," continued Esther, taking her seat and tucking into her food. "We do?" "Yes, the wedding preparations, of course," she smiled. "Jane has already started writing copious lists." "Perhaps that could wait until after the new year," said Henry, glancing at Amy. "There's so much going on right now." "You're probably right, but I don't know if you'll be able to halt Jane. She's terribly excited." Amy stared down at her toast, willing away the threatening tears. She loved Jane like a daughter and couldn't bear the prospect of that lovely girl marrying a devil. When Robert entered the dining room, Amy felt as though she'd been frozen to her seat. She regarded him with fresh eyes, trying to detect any hint of the demon she now knew dwelt inside him. But there was none. He looked so happy and handsome. The resemblance to his biological father had never seemed more pronounced, and her stomach lurched. With his thick black hair and eyes, sharp cheekbones and sulky mouth, he was Matthew reborn. Amy had always been able to see past that, but this morning it was suddenly difficult because she now knew him to be his father's son in more than just looks. "Morning all," he said cheerily. He paused by Amy's chair to kiss her cheek, his lips ice-cold. "Good morning, Mother. I hope you're feeling better." Amy looked to Henry, her tongue momentarily stolen. The sight of her husband's face restored her nerves. "Much, thank you, dear. It was just a headache. Too much wine last night." "Don't you mean Scotch?" said Arthur, light blue eyes twinkling. "I saw you tucking into the single malt." "Mother does adore her Speysides," said Robert, patting her shoulder, causing her to go rigid. She wanted him to sit far away from her. She couldn't bear him near her. "Are you sure you're all right, Amy?" said Mildred. "You've gone very pale." "I will be when I've eaten," she replied, picking up her mangled toast in an attempt to distract herself from Robert's malignant presence. "Robert, sit down and let your mother finish her breakfast," said Henry, noting his wife's discomfort. "We hear Jane's already planning the wedding," Mildred told Robert as he took his seat. "I know," he replied. "She's bursting with ideas." "You'll want to marry as soon as possible, I expect." "Most definitely," he said with his charming smile. "Surely there's no rush, Robert," said Amy, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "Why wait? We love each other," he replied, puzzled by the question. Amy took a deep breath, screwing up all her fear and hurt into a tight ball. Fortunately, her experiences at the hands of Matthew and Edward meant she had become adept at this. One of a lady's prime pleasures in life is her own wedding. Allow Jane to enjoy the excitement and preparation. She will only get to do it once. Robert relaxed. "Oh, I see. But she's as keen to become my wife as I am to be her husband." Amy couldn't even think about that. What if he unleashed his darker self on that poor girl on their wedding night? Amy couldn't stand it. However, it was vital she stayed strong to protect not only Jane, but all the other women Robert might hurt. A wedding is a precious thing, she said, looking to Henry, the sight of him fortifying her strength. Enjoy it, is all I'm saying. She took a bite of toast and let it drop back onto the plate. I have no appetite. I'll take a walk instead. In this weather? Said Arthur. Amy is very fond of walking in inclement weather, said Henry disapprovingly, and once made herself ill. That was because I wasn't prepared, countered Amy. This time I will be. She rose, the men at the table politely getting to their feet. If you insist, then I'm coming with you, said Henry. I'll come too, added Robert. No! Amy practically yelled at him, forcing herself to calm down when he looked shocked. Finish your breakfast, dear, she said more gently. Mildred and I won't be joining you either, said Arthur, looking to his wife. We'll be warm and cosy before the fire. Amy managed to give them a tight smile before hurrying from the room with Henry, Robert watching them go with a frown. Chapter 2. Slow down, Amy, you'll make yourself ill again, said Henry, marching along beside her. Their boots crunched through the deep snow, and it was an effort to remain upright, but Amy was determined, needing to exercise off some of her worries. It's my mind that's in pain, not my body, she retorted, and the only way to put it to rest is to speak to Daisy. You may have it all backwards. Oh, no, I don't. I'm finally seeing the truth after being blinded all these years. Like father, like son, that's what they say, isn't it? I find it difficult to believe Robert's capable of anything like that. She stopped and rounded on him. Didn't you once think Edward incapable? Her face crumpled at his stricken expression. Forgive me, Henry. I don't know what I'm saying. He embraced her. It's all right, but I insist we speak to Daisy and get the whole story. We will. I suppose there's no time like the present. With that, she suddenly veered off in another direction, circuiting around the back of the house, leaving Henry hurrying to catch up. They headed towards the servants' entrance that led directly into the kitchen, all the staff busy with their duties. The army of servants stopped when Henry and Amy entered, stamping snow from their boots. I do apologise for the intrusion at such a busy time, Mrs. Clapperton, said Amy, addressing the redoubtable cook who ran the kitchen with a rod of iron. Even their butler Rush was intimidated by her, but there was no denying she was a very talented cook. We need to speak to Daisy. What's that girl done now, my lady? I can deal with her, save you the bother, said Mrs. Clapperton, determinedly hitching up her considerable bosom. She's done nothing, but there is something I wish to discuss with her. I see, she said in a way that indicated she thought the whole situation strange indeed. She's in the scullery, my lady. Mrs. Clapperton looked to the houseboy. Billy, tell Daisy to go to Mr. Rush's room. Billy nodded and dashed out of the room. Thank you, said Amy. You may carry on. The kitchen burst back into life as the master and mistress left, heading down the passageway towards the small room Rush used as his headquarters. The man himself was absent, attending to his duties upstairs. Amy settled herself in the comfortable armchair, while Henry stationed himself against the wall, arms folded across his chest. Don't look so grim, Henry, said Amy. You'll frighten the life out of the poor girl. Sorry, he said, attempting to look more relaxed, and failing. There was a timid knock at the door, and Amy called, Come in. A small, pale girl with huge doe eyes and a tiny heart-shaped mouth tiptoed into the room. Even with her light brown hair scraped back off her face and stuffed beneath a white cap, she was still very pretty, small and delicate, easy to overpower. Amy shook the horrid thought away. Please sit, Daisy, she said as gently as she could. The girl was shaking so badly, Amy feared she might fall down. Don't worry, you're not in any trouble, but I assume you know what this is about. Daisy replied with a timid nod and took the spare chair in the corner of the room. You know what happened to me years ago at the hands of evil men. continued Amy. Yes, my lady, said Daisy, flushing. Then you'll know that I have a great deal of sympathy for any abuse you may be suffering. I hope so, she replied, eyes filling with tears. Would you mind showing Sir Henry your wrists? The girl unbuttoned the cuffs of her sleeves with shaking hands and rolled them back to reveal the ugly bruises. Henry couldn't help but wince as he was reminded of the state Amy's wrists had been in after she'd been tortured by his brother. He inhaled sharply and shook his head, while Daisy hastily buttoned up her cuffs. Who did this to you? Said Amy. I thought you knew, my lady. I need to hear you say it. Please, Daisy, she pressed when the girl remained silent. The girl shook as she took a deep breath before saying, Master Robert, I'm sorry, she cried, burying her face in her hands. Amy had known it was coming, but it was still a huge blow. When did this happen? 2 days ago. Amy's heart broke. This poor child, and she was only a child, Daisy couldn't have been more than 18, had endured something no one should ever have to. I need you to be very brave for me, Daisy, and tell me exactly what he's been doing. All the colour drained from her face. I can't, my lady, I just can't. Would it help if Sir Henry left? Perhaps, she said with an apologetic look Henry's way. I'll wait outside, he told Amy, throwing Daisy an encouraging smile on his way out. Take your time, Amy told Daisy when he'd gone. But you do understand that I have to know every detail if I'm going to make him stop. I won't get into trouble, will I? She replied. I would never blame the woman. You are the victim, Daisy. The girl nodded, wiped away her tears and sat up straighter in her seat. Master Robert used to be so nice to me, always polite and thanking me for working so hard for his family. On my days off when I went into the village, I would always bump into him and we'd walk together. I felt safe with him, even though he was far above my station, she hastened to add, avoiding her mistress's gaze. It's all right. Go on, encouraged Amy. On one of our walks, he kissed me. I was so surprised I didn't know what to do, and he is Master Robert, so I let him. After that, he kept giving me little presents. I thought he was so sweet, even though I knew there could never be any future. But I was confused too, because I knew he liked Miss Jane, who's so beautiful and rich. I didn't understand. Then he asked me to meet him in the woods. There's a pretty nook beside a stream. Suddenly he wasn't so nice. He hit me and I fell, then he started beating me. He ripped open the back of my dress and I saw a knife in his hand. I thought, Daisy's voice was choked with tears, and Amy grasped both her hands in her own deformed ones. It's all right. You're safe now. Daisy nodded, keeping her gaze locked on Amy's face, finding solace in this woman who understood her suffering. He used the knife to cut open the back of my dress and my corset. Then he beat my back with a stick, continued Daisy. It really hurt. I screamed. I thought that would make him stop, but he said I could scream all I liked and no one would hear me. He said he liked my screams. They excited him. Are you all right, my lady? Amy reeled as she was flung back in time into that cellar in Edward's London house, strapped face down to the table, his teeth sinking into her shoulder. Keep screaming for me. Shall I get you some water? Said Daisy, drawing her back to the present. Amy shook herself out of it. No, thank you. Just unpleasant memories surfacing. Please continue. He climbed on top of me and pressed my face into the grass. Dear God, whispered Amy, not sure she could bear listening to this girl relate how her son had raped her. He didn't do that to me, my lady. Daisy broke off, blushing furiously, fresh tears filling her eyes. He touched himself. I felt his warmth on the backs of my legs and he made this horrible groan. I'm sorry. she wailed before bursting into tears. Amy staggered to her feet and vomited into the small sink in the corner of the room. Daisy hurried to her side on weak legs. "My lady, are you all right?" Amy couldn't reply. She was back in that cellar again. The memory so clear it could have been yesterday, hearing Edward moan as his warmth landed on the backs of her thighs. "It seems you're just too damn exciting," he'd hissed in her ear. "Robert," whispered Amy before starting to cry. "I'm so sorry," said Daisy, forgetting protocol and rubbing a gentle hand up and down Amy's back. Right then they were just two women, all barriers pulled down by mutual suffering. "How do I know you're not making it up?" said Amy, rounding on the startled maid. "I'm telling the truth, my lady. I would never lie about something like this. I was tricked years ago by a maid who worked here. She made me believe Henry was a monster when in fact it was his brother. She was his lover and her lies helped destroy my life. How do I know you're not trying to do the same thing?" "I am not lying, I wouldn't. All I want is for it to stop," she exclaimed. "Then show me proof. Your word is not enough to accuse my son." Daisy's family might have been poor, but they were honest and proud. She tilted back her head. "Very well, my lady. If you want proof, then you shall have it." She practically tore open her dress to reveal her bare back. She wore no corset, and when Amy saw the state her skin was in, she understood why. Daisy's creamy flesh was crisscrossed with ugly red marks, permanent reminders of what Robert had done. "He left me alone and bleeding in the woods," said Daisy. "Somehow I found the strength to get up. It took a long time, but I managed to get back to the village. I went to my friend's house. She took me in and helped me get better. I never told her who did this to me because I wanted to protect your family. I thought you had been through enough." Amy felt dreadful. "I'm very sorry, Daisy. It's just so hard listening to such awful things about my own son." She helped the girl fasten up her dress, twisted fingers fumbling with the buttons. "I understand," Daisy said in a tired, weak voice. "No, it was inexcusable of me. I encouraged you to tell your tale, assured you I wouldn't blame you. Then I turned on you." "I think you were reliving some very disturbing memories." Amy nodded, exhausted. "Have you told anyone else about this?" "No, my lady." "I would appreciate it if you would keep it that way." "I will, but I'm afraid of him. Twice since he's cornered me upstairs. I've always been very careful to only walk into the village with one of the other maids, and it's making him angry. On Christmas Eve, he found me when I was making up the fire in the library. He pinned me up against the wall and said he would do all these horrible things to me. He said next time he would be inside me and it would hurt." "Robert will not go near you again, but in order for that to happen, you can't continue working here." "Don't look so downcast," Amy said, when Daisy's face fell. "I have a friend in the city who requires a new maid. It will be more money for you, and she's a sweet elderly lady who lives alone and won't have any young males in the house. Would you like that?" "Oh, yes, my lady, very much," said Daisy, starting to cry again. "Thank you." "You can leave in the new year. In the meantime, would you be able to stay with your friend?" "Yes, I think so." "Good. I'll pay you 3 months' wages, so you don't have to worry about being out of work." "That's not necessary, my lady. I won't say anything." "This isn't a bribe. It's recompense for what you've suffered at my son's hands. Do you know if he's done the same to any of the other maids?" "I don't think so, but I didn't discuss it with anyone." Amy nodded. "Now go and pack. The sooner you're away from Robert, the better. Come to Sir Henry's study and collect your wages before you leave. I'll send one of the servants to accompany you into the village." "Thank you. I don't know what to say. I'm so grateful." "I'm the one who should be grateful, Daisy. I've been so blind. Thank you for showing me the truth." Daisy gave her a little curtsy before leaving. Amy took a moment to compose herself. She had spawned a demon and fear for her son vied with fury. She'd been engaged to Henry when she was 17, after both her parents had died, and she'd been sent to live at Alardyce with family who were virtually strangers. After embarking on an affair with Matthew Kroll, who had been first footman at the time, she'd found herself pregnant and left with no option but to marry Henry, her older cousin, in order to save her reputation. It only emerged years later that her Aunt Lenora, Henry's mother, had ordered Matthew to seduce her in order to shame her and force her into marrying Henry, so her sizable fortune would be absorbed into the Alardyce estate. But Edward had tricked her into thinking Henry was a monster, so, rather than marry him, she'd fled to London, abandoning the man she now loved so fiercely. She'd done all that just so she could keep her son, and this was her reward: a pervert as bad as his father. Just the thought of her son thinking he'd got away with it, and that his family were blind to his true nature, was enough to make her burn with rage. She looked down at her twisted hands, deformed in defence of her son, and the rage shifted inside her. She would put Robert in his place if it was the last thing she did. Taking a deep breath, Amy stepped into the hallway and was relieved to see Henry waiting for her, receiving respectful yet curious glances from the servants as they passed, wondering why the master of the house was skulking outside the kitchens. Before they could discuss Daisy's revelation, the housekeeper appeared before them, seeming to emerge from the shadows. Mrs. Greer had worked for them for 5 years, replacing the dour Mrs. Adams, who had been housekeeper here for decades. She was tall and thin to the point of being spindly. Her long, thin white fingers played elegantly, almost sensuously, with the keys hanging from the belt of her severe black wool dress. Her face was well defined, bordering on beautiful, but her permanent scowl ruined her good looks. Her blonde hair was dusted with grey and pulled back into a bun so harsh it seemed to stretch her skin. Neither Henry nor Amy were particularly fond of her, but their house was run with ruthless efficiency, and the staff thought her firm but fair, so they tolerated her. "Sir Henry, Lady Alardyce," she said to them in turn. "Mrs. Clapperton's just informed me that you were speaking to Daisy. If the girl has done something wrong, I will reprimand her at once." "She's done nothing wrong," said Amy. "A friend of mine requires a new maid, and I thought she might like the position. It will raise her in the world." "That is most generous, but you're so busy with the Christmas celebrations. I would have been happy to speak to her on your behalf." "I'm aware of that, Mrs. Greer," said Amy with a warm smile that melted against the icy countenance of the housekeeper. "But my friend was badly let down by her last maid, and she asked me to vet any possible replacement personally." Mrs. Greer's eyes flicked to Henry. She wasn't a stupid woman. She was aware more was going on than they were telling her. The master of the house didn't usually come downstairs to deal with maids. "Now we need to return to our guests," said Henry, taking Amy's hand and leading her past the suspicious Mrs. Greer. "She's a very uncomfortable woman," he whispered to his wife as they made their way upstairs. Amy just nodded, already forgetting about the creepy housekeeper as she recalled Daisy's words. She was grateful Henry didn't quiz her about what had been said until they were alone in his study. "Well," he said the moment he closed the door behind them. "There's no doubt. Robert assaulted Daisy very brutally." "And you're certain she was being truthful?" Amy nodded sadly and sank into the armchair by the fire. "She showed me the injuries on her back. He lured her to that special spot by the stream in the woods. Then he beat her, lashed her back with a stick. Then he—" Amy's stomach heaved again as the memory of Edward's sickening groan returned. "Are you all right?" said Henry, hastening to her side. "Fine," she replied, swallowing down the bile. Henry poured her a scotch and held it out to her. "I know it's early, but these are special circumstances." "Thank you," she said, feeling the trembling subside as she gulped down the warming liquid. Robert did to Daisy what Edward did to me in that cellar when he got overexcited. Henry knew all too well what she was referring to. Edward had enjoyed explaining that part to him in sickening detail. He sighed and hung his head. Dear God. So he didn't violate her? No, although he threatened to. I'm sending her to Mrs. McLean's in the city. She needs a new maid, and if Daisy stays here, Robert will hurt her again. I dread to think what he'll do when he discovers she told on him. What frightens me most is that he acted in the exact same way as Edward and Matthew. He charmed and romanced her first, made her believe she was special, and once she was under his spell, he showed his true colours. Henry's face was even whiter than usual. It's happening again, isn't it? She nodded and grasped his hand. Only this time it will be worse. Robert's father was Matthew, and he's related to Edward through me. He has both of their blood in his veins. He's going to be twice as bad as either of them. We don't know that. Hopefully, if we act now, we can stop it in its tracks. What if this is something that starts as manhood approaches, along with all its associated urges? Said Amy. When did it start with Edward? Hard to say, replied Henry thoughtfully. He always was odd, but I think he really started to change when he was about 15, 16. Robert's 17. We need to discuss this with Robert. We can't with guests in the house. We have to keep this quiet. That'll be Daisy, she said when there was a knock at the door. I promised her 3 months' wages as compensation. Let's make it 4 months, he said before calling, Enter! Daisy walked in and stood before Henry's desk, shuffling with anxiety, giving the impression that she couldn't wait to leave the house. Henry dipped into his desk drawer, took out some money, sealed it in an envelope and handed it over. 4 months' wages, he said. Thank you, sir, she replied, taking the envelope he held out to her and staring at it in astonishment. Has an escort been arranged for you? Amy asked her. Yes, my lady. George is waiting for me downstairs. George was their second footman. Good. There was the sound of a door opening further down the corridor, and they heard Arthur and Robert conversing in their deep basses. Daisy physically jumped at the sound of Robert's voice, dropping the envelope on the floor. I'm so sorry, she said, eyes filling with tears, groping to pick it up again. Don't apologise, said Henry, walking around the desk and retrieving it for her when she failed to manage it with her shaking hands. You've done nothing wrong. Remember that. Thank you, sir. I will. You're welcome. I'll walk you back to the servants' hall. She curtsied, and Amy remained where she was to finish her scotch, while Henry walked Daisy out. She was exhausted already, and it was only 10:30 in the morning. Soon she would have to face her son, look him in the eye and pretend everything was all right until their guests had gone. When she did finally confront him, there would be shouting, denials, insults thrown back and forth. It would be awful. Robert would deny everything, of course, but she had all the proof she needed. She'd thought Robert was different, that his shining goodness had transcended Matthew's rottenness, but it seemed it was firmly embedded in his core. I escorted her to the servants' hall without incident, said Henry, returning to the room. Poor thing was shaking like a leaf. She almost broke into a run in her eagerness to escape the house. Mrs. Greer knows something's going on. You should have seen the look she gave me when I entered the servants' hall with a maid. We might not be able to keep this entirely secret. Our servants are loyal. They'll keep their mouths shut. Henry regarded her with concern. You look unwell. Why don't you go back to bed? I'll make your excuses to our guests. I will not cower from this, and I have to face Robert eventually. The longer I leave it, the harder it will get. I applaud your courage, and I'll be right beside you. Amy got to her feet and kissed him. I must have done something right in my sinful life to have found you. I love you so very much. I love you too, and we will tackle this together. She flung her arms around his neck. Thank you. "You're welcome," he said, hugging her. "By the way, Nanny told me John and Stephen are awake and asking for you." These were their younger children. John was 5 and Stephen was 3. Their older sister Lydia was 6. Henry was father to all 3. Only Robert had a different father, although Henry went to great pains to make sure he never felt like an outsider. Now he was afraid all his efforts had been in vain. "I'll go to them," said Amy. "Are they in the schoolroom?" "I'm afraid not. They've had breakfast and they're in the drawing room with the others." Amy took a deep breath. "Then it's time to face Robert. I can't cope with this without you, Henry." "You won't have to, I promise. And you can do this. After all you've endured, you have the strength." She gave him an uncertain smile as they left the study and made their way towards the drawing room. Robert's deep voice was audible as they approached the door. Her grip tightened on Henry's arm as he pushed open the door and they stepped inside. "Mama!" cried 5-year-old John, hurling himself at her skirts. "It's Boxing Day!" "I know, sweetheart," she said, keeping her gaze locked on the top of his head so she wouldn't have to look at her eldest child, who occupied a chair by the window, talking with Arthur. "I want to play in the snow," announced John. "Nanny says it's too cold." "I'll take you out later, but only for a short while," replied Amy. John was just like his mother. He couldn't stand being cooped up inside all day either. They both particularly suffered in the winter months. Henry was perfectly at home by the fire with a book, as were Lydia and Stephen. "Are you all right, Mother?" It was Robert's voice. Amy didn't want to look at him. She wasn't sure what her reaction would be, so she kept her gaze fixed on John as she replied, "Much better, thank you." Fortunately, everyone's attention was taken off her when Jane entered the room. Amy couldn't help but look at Robert as he rose to greet his bride-to-be, clasping both her hands in his own and gazing at her adoringly. Amy's attention was drawn to his hands. They were large and powerful, and she was revolted by them, now she knew what they were capable of. Robert led Jane to the couch so he could sit beside her, the happiness shining from the girl's eyes, breaking Amy's heart. William, Esther's husband, was the last to enter the room. He did enjoy a lie-in. "I slept like a log last night," he said. "Your beds are so extremely comfortable, Amy." "Thank you," she replied distractedly. "Bless, look at those two," smiled Esther, nodding at Robert and Jane, who were oblivious to the rest of the room. "They're such a perfect match, aren't they?" Esther frowned when Amy failed to reply. "Aren't they?" But Amy was too busy watching Robert and Jane. "Amy," said Esther, patting her arm, "is something wrong?" Amy knew she would have to tell her friend the truth at some point, but not today. She would let Esther enjoy the festive period before casting a huge shadow over her life. "Sorry, I was miles away," she said. "Is it that headache? Do you still have it?" "A tad, and it's wearing me down." "Come on, Sean, let your poor mother sit down," said Esther, ushering the boy back to play with his brother and insisting Amy take a seat. Henry immediately took his place beside her. The conversation went on around Amy, everyone laughing and joking, but she was incapable of joining in. She couldn't keep her gaze off Robert and Jane. She wanted to leap up and scream at him to take his filthy hands off her. "Amy, you must stop staring," Henry whispered in her ear. "Sorry," she said, blinking back tears. "Father," said Robert's deep voice, cutting through all the other conversation in the room, "can we arrange for the banns to be read soon?" Said Henry, glancing at Amy. "Don't you want to decide where you're getting married first?" "We've already decided, here at Alardyce Church." "That was quick," said Amy, keeping her eyes on John and Stephen playing in the corner. Robert's dark eyes flickered. "You seem very concerned about the speed of all this, Mother." "I just don't see the rush. You're both so young." "Come on, Amy, they're in love," said Esther. "What's the problem?" "No problem," she replied, looking down at her hands. "Your mother's just a little tired," said Henry, patting her hand. "Is that right, Mother?" said Robert. She had to look him in the face. If she didn't, everyone would know something was wrong. "Yes, dear," she said, finally looking his way. "So very tired." "You should go back to bed." "You know me. I'm not one to lounge about in bed until all hours. I'll have a lie down after lunch." Robert stared back at her steadily, and she knew he'd realised something wasn't right, but she was quite sure he didn't suspect what that was. Chapter 3. It was decided they would all go outside to enjoy the snow, which had finally stopped, a watery sun managing to penetrate the thick grey clouds. They all donned their boots, cloaks and gloves, except for Arthur and Mildred, who claimed the armchairs by the drawing-room fire instead. Robert played with the younger children, throwing snowballs before hoisting Stephen onto his shoulders, making him laugh. "He'll make a wonderful father," said Esther, as she and Amy looked on. "Yes," was all Amy replied. "Right, I've had enough of this. What's wrong? And don't deny it, because I know you're unhappy about this wedding. I don't understand why. We've all been expecting it." "Nothing's wrong." "Don't give me that. I know you too well, Amy Alardyce. Is Jane suddenly not good enough to marry into your family?" "Don't be ridiculous. Robert's not good enough for her." Esther was completely confused, but before she could quiz her about this cryptic comment, the twins let up a wail as they fell onto their bottoms in the snow. "We'll discuss this later," said Esther before rushing to her children. Like Amy, Esther preferred to be a hands-on mother, even though she employed a nanny. "Esther knows something's not right," Amy quietly told Henry as he sidled up to her. "It was bound to happen. She's an intelligent woman. Let's get you inside. You're shaking with cold." Amy hoped it would just be the two of them, but the entire party insisted on accompanying them back to the house, the weather too cold to stay out for long. Rush was waiting to greet them with hot chocolate. "You all look chilled," smiled Arthur, who was sitting before the fire in the drawing-room with a blanket over his knees and a book in his hand, Mildred occupying the armchair on the opposite side of the fire with her embroidery. Before Amy could take a sip of her hot chocolate, she was pulled into the sitting-room by Esther. Henry watched them go, wondering if he should go to his wife, when Robert approached him. "Father, I really need to speak to you." After growing up with a nightmare of a mother, Henry had grown used to hiding his feelings, an ability that had made Amy think he was a callous monster when they were younger. If he'd been capable back then of expressing how he truly felt, Amy wouldn't have had her affair with Matthew, Edward wouldn't have tricked her, and she wouldn't have run away in fear. And this man wouldn't be standing before him now. "Can't it wait?" said Henry. "I'm afraid not." Henry resisted the urge to sigh. "Very well." Robert followed him into his study. "Well, what is it?" said Henry. "Is Mother upset about my engagement to Jane?" Henry wasn't sure how to answer. It was too soon for Robert to know the truth, so a lie was called for. "Of course not. We all knew this day would come." "Then why does she keep telling us to slow down? No one does that. When an engagement is announced, then the wedding soon follows." "She's just a bit under the weather. She's worked so hard to make this Christmas perfect for everyone." "And you've ruined it," he thought, hoping his anger didn't show. "What has that got to do with me marrying Jane? I thought it would make her happy. Like I said, she's not very well. When she's recovered, I'm sure she'll be more enthusiastic. No, there's more to it. Something's wrong, and I want to know what it is." Henry sighed. "Very well. I think all this talk about weddings is bringing back bad memories." "What do you mean?" "Amy was Jane's age the first time she was engaged to me, and in this very house." Robert looked relieved. "I see. I never thought of it like that. You know what she's been through and how it affects her. The past is never really gone, and sometimes it sneaks up on her and takes her by surprise. Just give her time." Thank you, Father. I hate to think of my engagement causing her pain. I'll stop talking about it so much. Good idea. Henry was relieved when he left, eager to return to his fiancée. His lie had done the trick, but Robert would soon work out something else was going on. I want to know what you've got against this wedding, and I want to know now, Esther demanded of Amy. Jane was her niece. She'd taken on responsibility for her after her mother had died, and she was like a daughter to her. I've got nothing against it. I'm just so tired, she replied, slumping into a chair. You said Robert isn't good enough for Jane. Why would you say that about your own son? Amy thought she should tell Esther the truth, but she couldn't, not yet, not until she'd confronted Robert. Despite everything, he was still her boy. I've been having strange dreams. I keep thinking about how you were married to Matthew and how that ended. If you're worried about history repeating itself, it won't. Robert's not his father. Amy didn't even try to respond to that. I suppose when I said Robert wasn't good enough, I was thinking of Matthew. She sighed, making a show of putting a hand to her head, feeling a genuine headache building. I'm so confused. I'm sorry, Amy. I never thought. Robert's resemblance to Matthew is so startling. Go on, said Amy when she trailed off. Sometimes it feels like Matthew's still here. Amy swallowed hard and nodded. I know exactly what you mean. That evening they all gathered in the drawing room to play cards and enjoy the company of family and close friends, the snow outside and roaring fires inside making for a cosy atmosphere. For Amy, it was torture, because Robert insisted on sitting by her side and continually inquiring after her health. Henry made sure he was stationed on her other side, giving her hand a gentle squeeze when he felt she needed the reassurance, or when he thought she might actually blow up with rage. Amy in a temper was a spectacle to behold. Finally, the time came when she could retire to bed without seeming rude. Minutes after she'd retired, Henry joined her in her bedroom, deciding to leave Robert to play host. Strictly speaking, it was Amy's bedroom, but they slept together every night. When Henry walked in, her maid Hazel was helping her undress. Amy stood in the middle of the room in just her corset and shift. Her face was pale and pinched, and Henry knew she couldn't keep her emotions in any longer. You may go, he told Hazel, who curtsied and left. When he took his wife in his arms, he thought she might cry. Instead, she released what sounded like a growl into his shoulder, then started to pace the room. That must have been difficult for you, he said. Difficult, she exclaimed. I was torn between weeping for him and slapping him. I see it all so clearly now, the slyness in his eyes, that intolerable smirk. He thinks we're all brainless fools. Well, he's going to get a shock, and if he doesn't sort himself out, I'll make him see that this path will only lead him to the hangman's noose. Amy stopped pacing and sighed. It pains me to have so many bad thoughts about my own son. All the years you and I were separated by Edward's lies, I had the consolation that at least I had Robert. Now that's been taken away. If I hadn't been pregnant with Robert, I would have stayed here. I would have realised you were the good man you are. We could have had so much more time together. But we found each other again. I thank God for that every day. Amy's smile was tender. As do I. But what are we going to do? First of all, you need to rest. You're exhausted. Hopefully, after a good night's sleep, we'll come up with a plan. I need to sleep. I feel so fuzzy-headed. Could you call Hazel back? No need. I can assist you to undress. I've done it often enough, he said, stroking her cheek. The playfulness returned to her eyes. If you're brave enough to tackle a corset, then feel free. I've got the hang of it, and it only took me 9 years. Now, turn around. She presented him with her back, and he quickly unlaced the corset, leaving her in just her shift. I'm impressed, she said. I know. Sit on the bed. She perched on the end of the bed, and he sat beside her to remove the pins from her hair. Amy closed her eyes and sighed with pleasure as he ran his fingers through it. "You are still as lovely as the day you first came to live here," he said, pressing his face into her hair, which was still a rich chestnut colour, the tresses thick and glossy. Amy leaned back against him to enjoy his touch. Henry looked down and inhaled sharply at the sight of her large, creamy breasts, visible through the transparent material of the shift, and his body reacted involuntarily. "Sorry, I didn't come here for that," he said. "I only wanted to make sure you were all right." She turned to face him. "You haven't finished helping me undress," she said. He removed the shift and kissed her, pressing her back onto the bed as she slid his jacket off his shoulders. "Is this a good idea?" he said half-heartedly. "You need some rest." "I've just endured one of the worst days of my life. What I need is my husband." She pulled his shirt off over his head and cast it aside. "Now." Amy clung onto Henry almost desperately as he made love to her, pressing her face into his neck, repeatedly thanking God for him. Eventually, not even her worries about Robert could withstand the pleasure coursing through her body, so she gave in to it, letting her fears go. After insisting Henry lie on his back, she straddled him and bore down, moving frantically in an effort to rid herself of her frustration and fear until it all burst forth. Amy flung back her head, her long hair grazing Henry's bare thighs, body convulsing, enjoying the feel of his warmth flooding inside her. "I have an amazing wife," exclaimed Henry, soaked with sweat, pulling her down to him for a kiss. She lay beside him and snuggled into his chest. "I do feel better," she murmured, already on the verge of sleep. "Good," he said softly. She drifted off with a smile on her face. Amy knew before she even opened her eyes that something was wrong. A lethargy had taken hold of her, so virulent she was unable to move, and her skin was burning. Henry's voice sounded far away, and she couldn't understand what he was saying. She'd felt like this before only twice in her life. Once as a child, and the second time when she was 17 and had come to live at Alardyce. She'd got soaked to the skin after a walk in the rain and had succumbed to a fever. Amy surmised that this time the pressure of what she had learned about Robert had done for her. She managed to force her eyes open, and Henry's blurred face hovered over her, his handsome features vague. He disappeared from view, and she tried to turn her head, needing to see him, but she couldn't move. Then Hazel was standing over her, slipping her nightgown on over her head to hide her nakedness and brushing her hair. Why was she bothering? The penny dropped when Dr. Parlow walked into the room, the young, dynamic doctor who had been so kind to her when she was pregnant with Robert. He was older now, of course, hair receding and a little plumper, but he was still the good, kind man who had permanently replaced the crotchety old doctor who had patched up the maids at Alardyce House, victims of Edward's sick desires, and said nothing to the authorities. She was glad Dr. Parlow was here and not him. "Amy, how are you?" he said, peering down at her. She tried to reply, but her tongue was thick in her mouth, and instead she released an unintelligible groan. To her relief, Henry appeared beside him, and her hand groped across the bed towards him. "It's all right, darling. Dr. Parlow will get you well again." Henry's words were meant to be comforting, but the worry in his eyes spoilt it. "She had this before, years ago," he told the doctor. "Yes, I remember attending to her," replied Parlow. "Perhaps you should wait outside while I examine her, Sir Henry. Her maid can assist me if necessary." "I'm not leaving her," he retorted. Parlow nodded approvingly. This wasn't a common stance for the husbands of his wealthy patients to take, and he found Sir Henry's concern for his wife touching. After performing a swift examination, Parlow announced, "She has a fever, and her temperature is dangerously high. I have some Warburg's tincture in my bag that should break her fever. Fortunately, I have it in liquid form, because she certainly can't manage the tablets, he said, measuring out a dose before dripping it into her mouth. I knew we shouldn't have gone out for that walk in the snow yesterday, said Henry. That wouldn't have helped. Lady Alardyce, you must stop taking walks in bad weather, chided the doctor. But she couldn't hear him. My God, exclaimed Henry when her eyes rolled back in her head. Look at her. Will she recover? She's a very strong woman, replied Parlow, neatly dodging the question. You must keep all the other members of the family away, especially the young children, just in case it's contagious. We can't afford to take any chances. I will attend to her myself. Parlow was unable to disguise his astonishment. As you wish, but as I said, this could be contagious. No one in the house caught it the last time she was ill. As long as you're aware of the risk. I am. Parlow packed up his things. I'll visit this evening. There's nothing more I can do for now. Keep the room well aired and her head elevated. Bathe her regularly with cold water to keep her cool. If the situation changes, contact me immediately. After giving Henry a list of do's and don'ts, the doctor left Henry alone with his wife. Henry dragged a chair to her bedside, picked up the flannel Hazel had provided, dipped it into the bowl of cold water, and used it to bathe Amy's forehead. There was nothing else he could do. He was forced to stop a few minutes later when she started to toss and turn violently on the bed. The last time she'd been ill like this, he'd kept a similar vigil by her bedside. His mother had been hoping she'd die, his father had a morbid fear of sickness, and the maid Nettie had only done the bare minimum. He was the one who'd mopped her brow, who'd dripped water onto her dry lips and held her hand during the terrifying nightmares. But she hadn't even been aware he was there. Not only had he nursed her through her sickness, he'd also protected her from Edward, who he was sure had intended to exploit her while she was helpless. Then, when she was recovered and lucid again, she'd awoken to find him in her room and had assumed he was there to hurt her thanks to Edward's lies. Now was so different. She'd been reaching out to him as the doctor had examined her. She needed him, and he was damned if he was going to lose her. It wasn't the snow that had done this to her. It was grief. The last time this had happened, she'd just lost both parents and had been forced to live in an unwelcoming house with unfeeling strangers. This time, her own son's evil had laid her low. When she'd settled down, he started to bathe her face again, frightened by how her skin burned. She began to murmur his name. I'm here, he said, clasping her hand. I won't leave you. She didn't respond. A knock at the door had him leaping to his feet. Don't come in, he cried, afraid it was one of the children. He opened the door a crack and peered out, dismayed to see it was Robert. You can't come in, he practically snarled at him. Robert was taken aback.